The wind off the Tyrrhenian Sea reaches the rocks of Corsica before it reaches the man, and the man has been here long enough that he no longer turns his face toward it. He is 44 years old, accused of adultery with a princess he may never have touched, stripped of his property in Rome, and set down on an island whose interior is barren and whose coast is feverish, and he has just received word that his mother Helvia is grieving for him as the dead are grieved for. He takes up a stylus, because the only answer he can give her is the one she would refuse to accept if he gave it in any other form. What he writes to her will become one of the strangest documents in the history of consolation. It is strange because the man who has been exiled writes to comfort the woman who has not been. It is strange because he refuses, from the first line, to grant that his condition deserves the grief she is offering it. And it is strange because, in writing it, he is forced to test whether the philosophy he has spent his life professing can actually hold its shape when pressed against the body of a man on a rock in the sea. The principle we will consider in this episode is the principle of consolation, as Seneca understood it, and more precisely, the limit that the mind places upon the power of place. The Stoics inherited from their Greek predecessors a conviction which Seneca states in his own way again and again, that the soul is not bounded by the walls that bound the body, that exile is a change of location and not a change of self, and that the man who carries his reason with him has carried with him everything that matters. It is a hard doctrine. Seneca knew it was hard. He did not pretend otherwise. In the Consolation he sends to his mother, which we know now as the Consolatio ad Helviam Matrem, he writes, in the older translation, "I have never trusted fortune, even when she seemed to be at peace. All those things which she heaped upon me, money, office, influence, I deposited in a place from which she could take them back without disturbing me." This is the principle stated as he wishes his mother to receive it. Fortune has not robbed him, because he never accepted fortune's gifts as his own. The villa in Rome, the senatorial dignity, the standing at court, these were on loan, and the loan has been called in, and the man himself remains. One must consider what is being claimed here, and one must consider it carefully. Seneca is not saying that exile does not hurt. He is not saying that the body does not suffer cold and the mind does not suffer monotony. He is saying that the harm of exile, whatever it amounts to, falls upon things which are not the self. The Stoic distinction here is technical and old. There are things which are in our power and things which are not. The body, the reputation, the property, the city we live in. These are not in our power because they can be taken from us by forces we do not control. The judgment we form about these things is in our power, and it is the judgment, not the loss, that constitutes the suffering. This is what Stoic consolation is. It is not a soothing. It is not the placing of a soft cloth over a wound. It is the redrawing of the line that separates the wounded thing from the self. The consoler, on the Stoic account, does not minimize the event. He relocates the event. He says, yes, this has happened, and it has happened to the body, or to the reputation, or to the place where the body resides. It has not happened to you. We are told by the Stoic teachers, and Seneca repeats this with his own emphasis, that no place can imprison a mind which has not consented to imprisonment, and no exile can banish a man who carries his citizenship in his reason. This is the principle. We will see, in what follows, how he tested it. To understand what the principle cost him, we must understand the circumstance into which it was put. The year is 41 of the Common Era. The Emperor Claudius has come to the throne after the assassination of Caligula, and the new court is, as new courts often are, hungry for proofs of loyalty and proofs of the disgrace of those who flourished under the previous regime. Messalina, the wife of Claudius, holds extraordinary influence, and she has decided that Julia Livilla, the niece of the emperor and sister of the murdered Caligula, is a threat to be removed. The charge brought against Julia Livilla is adultery. The man named as her partner is Lucius Annius Seneca. We do not know whether the charge was true. The ancient sources, Tacitus and Dio among them, treat it with the skepticism reserved for political accusations made by suspicious empresses. What we do know is that Seneca was condemned, that his property was largely confiscated, that he was permitted to live, and that he was sent to the island of Corsica, which the Romans regarded as one of the worst destinations available to a man of cultivated tastes. Corsica was rough country. Its coastal lowlands carried malarial fevers in the summer. Its interior was mountainous and inhabited by tribes whose Latin was poor or absent. There were no schools of rhetoric, no libraries to speak of, no patrons to attend, no clients to receive at dawn. For a man whose entire adult life had been arranged around the rhythms of the Roman public day, the silence must have been complete. He was 44 when he arrived. He would be 52 when he left. 8 years. We have to attend to the body in this circumstance because Seneca did. He suffered from a respiratory illness throughout his life, almost certainly some form of asthma or chronic bronchitis, which he describes in his letters with a clinical specificity. The attacks would come upon him without warning. He could not breathe. He thought more than once that he was dying. To suffer such attacks on Corsica, where there was no physician of standing, where the air in summer was thick with sickness and the winters cold and damp against stone walls, was a punishment of a particular kind. The Roman administration of exile was not designed to be lethal in the way that later prisons would be lethal. It was designed to remove a man from the political life of the city, but removal for a man like Seneca was its own slow attrition. He had left a wife in Rome. He had left, by some accounts, a young son who would die during the years of his exile and whom he would not see again. He had left his mother, Helvia, his father Seneca the elder, having died not long before, and an aunt who had raised him in his boyhood when his lungs were already weak and the dry air of Egypt was prescribed for him. The household into which he had been born and the household he had built were both, by his absence, made smaller, and the news of these contractions reached him slowly and from a great distance. His brothers remained in Rome and in the service of the emperor. Gallio the elder would later be the proconsul of Achaia, before whom the apostle Paul would be brought, according to the book of Acts. Mela, the younger, would become the father of the poet Lucan. These were men of standing. They could not openly advocate for their disgraced brother without endangering themselves. They wrote, they sent what could be sent, but they could not bring him home. And here is the detail which the biographers return to. Seneca did write from Corsica a work addressed to Polybius, who was a freedman of Claudius and a man of influence at court, and in that work he praised the emperor in terms which later readers, and Seneca himself, in his later years, found embarrassing. The Consolatio ad Polybium is a strange document. It is ostensibly a consolation to Polybius on the death of his brother. It contains, alongside its philosophical commonplaces, passages of explicit flattery of Claudius, the man who had exiled him. It reads, to many, as a request for recall. It did not work. He stayed on the island. We mention this because the man who wrote the Consolation to his mother is the same man who wrote the Consolation to Polybius. The Stoic doctrine he professed and the political longing he could not extinguish were both present in him at once. He is not a marble figure. He is a man who is cold and ill and tired of stone, and who is also trying to live according to a principle which he believes to be true, and who sometimes succeeds at the second and sometimes fails. The Consolation to Helvia is a record of one of his successes. We should read it as such, knowing what the failures cost him. The island itself becomes a kind of presence in the work. He describes its barrenness, its rocky coast, its absence of cultivated fields. He admits that no man would choose such a place. He does not pretend that Corsica is Rome, but what he is doing, in describing it, is preparing the ground for the argument he intends to make to his mother, that the badness of the place is not the same thing as the badness of his condition, and that her grief should be sized to the latter and not the former. Now we come to the work itself, and to what the principle of consolation actually demanded of him in the writing of it. The opening of the Consolatio ad Helviam Matrem is one of the most arresting in ancient literature. He tells his mother that he has wanted for some time to write to her, and that he has hesitated, because he could find no precedent. He searched, he says, for an example of a man who consoled his own kin, while he himself was the subject of the misfortune being mourned, and he could find none. The consoler is supposed to be on dry ground. The consoler is supposed to extend a hand to the one in the water. Seneca is in the water, and he is extending a hand to his mother, who is on the shore, weeping for him. He writes, in Aubrey Stewart's older rendering, "I have often had the impulse to write to you, and as often checked it. Many things urged me to make the attempt. In the first place, I seemed to be laying aside all my troubles, when I had wiped away your tears, even if I could not stop them." Read that again, slowly. He is not promising to make her stop crying. He is saying that even the wiping away of the tears, even the partial gesture, would be enough to relieve him. The consolation is mutual. By consoling her, he consoles himself. By formulating the argument that his exile is not the catastrophe she takes it to be, he reinforces in his own mind the conviction that allows him to endure it. The body of the work proceeds methodically. He addresses, one by one, the elements of his condition which his mother fears for him, and he undertakes to show that none of them is in fact a harm. He addresses the loss of country. He addresses the poverty into which he has been reduced. He addresses the loss of reputation. He addresses the physical hardships of the island. He addresses the absence of friends and the silence of his former life. On the loss of country, he writes that the wise man is at home in every place because the universe is his city. This is not original to Seneca. It is a Stoic commonplace going back to Diogenes the Cynic and through Zeno to Chrysippus. But Seneca gives it a specific texture. He observes that the stars are visible from Corsica as they are visible from Rome, and that the same sun rises and sets, and that the philosophical questions which occupied him in the city occupy him still on the island. The mind, he says, requires nothing of the place where the body is set down, except that it permit the mind to think. Corsica permits this. Therefore, Corsica is sufficient. On poverty, he reminds his mother of the simplicity in which his ancestors lived, and of the long Stoic tradition which holds that the wise man's needs are few, and that the satisfaction of those few needs is achievable in almost any circumstance. He writes that nature requires little, and that what nature requires is everywhere available, and that what is not everywhere available is therefore not required by nature, but only by opinion. He has water, he has bread, he has the capacity to read and to write. The rest, he says, was ornament, and ornament can be removed without injury to the structure. On reputation, he is perhaps less convincing, and the modern reader feels the strain. Seneca cared about his reputation. He cared about it as a Roman of senatorial rank cared about it, which is to say, completely. The argument he makes to his mother on this point is the argument he must make, the Stoic argument, that the opinion of others is not in our power, that the only judgment of a man's worth which has any standing is the judgment of his own conscience, and that the man who is innocent of the charges against him remains innocent regardless of what the courts say. But one can hear, behind the argument, the longing of a man who has been publicly disgraced, and who knows that the disgrace will follow him whether or not it is deserved. He makes the argument because he believes it must be true. Whether he felt it to be true at every moment, we cannot know. On the physical hardships, he is candid. He does not pretend that Corsica is comfortable. He acknowledges that the climate is harsh and that the company is poor, but he insists that hardship borne with reason is not the same as hardship borne without it, and that the mind which understands its situation suffers less than the mind which does not. He cites examples from history, men who endured exile and emerged unbroken, men who endured worse than exile and continued to think and write and live well. Rutilius Rufus, who refused to return from his banishment when offered the chance. Metellus Numidicus, who bore his disgrace with composure. These were Romans of the old school, and Seneca holds them up to his mother as the type of his own intended endurance. And then comes the passage which gives the work its center. He tells his mother that she must not grieve for him as if he were unhappy, because he is not unhappy. He says that he occupies himself with the study of nature, with philosophy, with the contemplation of the heavens, with the writing that he has always wanted to do and never had the leisure to do in Rome. Exile, he suggests, has given him what the city took away. The clients no longer come at dawn. The patrons no longer summon him. The lawsuits do not require his attention. He has, for the first time in his adult life, his own day to dispose of as he wishes. This is again both true and a performance. Both can be true at once. The Stoic does not pretend that he is happy when he is not, but the Stoic does seek to identify, in any condition, the goods that condition makes possible, and to occupy himself with those goods rather than with the goods that have been withdrawn. Seneca, on Corsica, wrote not only the Consolations, but also, by most accounts, some of his early treatises on natural philosophy and on ethics. The work was real. The discipline was real. The man was not pretending. He closes the Consolation with an injunction to his mother to turn from her grief to her studies. to her grandchildren, to her sister, to the activities that had sustained her before the disaster fell. He does not ask her to forget him. He asks her to remember him in the way he wishes to be remembered, which is as a man still engaged in the practice of his philosophy, and not as a man broken upon a rock. The Stoic doctrine of consolation requires then three things. It requires that the consoler distinguish between the event and the self. It requires that the consoler identify the goods that remain, and it requires that the consoler invite the mourner into the same discipline, so that the mourning ends not in forgetting, but in a recomposed activity. Seneca attempts all three of these in the work to his mother. He attempts them under conditions in which he himself is the subject of the mourning. This is what makes the document remarkable, and this is what makes it useful to us. What then is the structural lesson the philosopher is teaching us? Let us state it as plainly as he tried to state it to Helvia. The first part of the lesson is that place does not determine condition. The body is set down somewhere. The body must be set down somewhere. But the mind, which is the seat of the self on the Stoic account, is not located in the place where the body is located. The mind is wherever its attention is. A man whose attention is upon a mathematical problem is, for the duration of his attention, with the problem and not in the room. A man whose attention is upon the structure of the cosmos is with the cosmos. Corsica cannot reach the cosmos. Rome could not reach it either. The mind that travels there travels by its own road, and the road is open from any starting point. This is not a denial of the body's circumstance. Seneca does not deny that he was cold, or that he was ill, or that he missed his family. The lesson is not that the body's circumstance is unreal. The lesson is that the body's circumstance is not the totality of the man's life, and that to allow it to become the totality is to surrender to the misfortune more than the misfortune has actually demanded. The second part of the lesson is that consolation, properly conducted, is not a softening, but a clarification. When we comfort one another, we are tempted to minimize the loss. We say it was not so bad. We say it will pass. We say things will return to what they were. Seneca does none of this with his mother. He does not say his exile is brief, because he does not know that it is brief. He does not say his disgrace is light, because he knows it is not. What he does instead is to clarify the loss. He says, "Here is what has happened. Here is what has not happened. The first list is shorter than you fear, and the second list is longer than you have considered." To console is to assist the mourner in seeing the loss as it is, and to discover that the loss as it is, while real, is bounded. The third part of the lesson is the part most difficult to state and most important to grasp. It is that the consoler and the mourned are not always different persons. Seneca, in writing to his mother, is not only consoling her, he is consoling himself. The act of articulating for another the reasons one's condition is endurable is the same act by which one reinforces in oneself the disposition to endure it. The Stoic exercises which Seneca and Marcus and Epictetus all recommend, the morning preparation, the evening review, the rehearsal of misfortunes that have not yet happened, are exercises of articulation. They are exercises in saying the thing one believes until one believes the thing one says. The Consolation to Helvia is such an exercise on a grand scale. By writing it, Seneca becomes more capable of living it. There is something else, and we should not pass by it. The principle of consolation, as Seneca practiced it, was not a doctrine that could be applied once and then set aside. It was a posture that had to be re-entered every day. The wind off the sea blew every morning. The illness returned. The reports from Rome came, and sometimes they were bad. The principle did not exempt him from feeling these things. The principle gave him a place to stand while he felt them. Stoicism does not promise the absence of suffering. It promises that suffering will not be the whole of what one is. We are told by some readers that the Stoics were cold men, that their consolations are inhuman, that the refusal to grieve fully is itself a kind of cruelty. This is a misunderstanding. The Stoic does grieve. Seneca grieved. He grieved for his son, who died during his exile, and he grieved for his own ruined career, and he grieved for the mother he could not embrace. What he refused was not the feeling. What he refused was the conclusion that the feeling licensed a collapse of the will. The wise man, on the Stoic account, suffers and continues. The unwise man suffers and stops. The difference is not in the suffering. The difference is in what comes after. And there is one final element of the lesson, which Seneca's biography forces upon us. He did, in the end, return from Corsica. Agrippina, the new wife of Claudius, recalled him in the year 49 to serve as tutor to her young son, the boy who would become the Emperor Nero. The years that followed gave Seneca wealth and influence beyond anything he had known before his exile. They also gave him the long, increasingly impossible task of attempting to moderate the cruelties of a man who would not be moderated. He died by his own hand on the order of Nero in the year 65. The exile was not the worst thing that happened to him. We mention this not to undermine the consolation, but to set it in its full context. The man who wrote that the mind is not bounded by place lived to discover that the mind is not bounded by good fortune either, and that the principle which sustained him on Corsica was the same principle that would sustain him in the bath where he opened his veins. The doctrine held. The circumstances changed. The man kept his stance. Consider, then, the question this work leaves you with. You have no doubt complained at some point in your life about where you are, about the city, or the room, or the situation in which you find yourself. You have said, perhaps to yourself, and perhaps aloud, that if you were elsewhere, you would be different, that if the circumstances were different, you would be different, that the place has taken something from you, or is taking something from you now. Seneca on Corsica would have understood the complaint. He would not have mocked it, but he would have asked you a question, and the question is this: what precisely has the place removed from you? Name it, not in general terms, but in particulars. What capacity of your mind, what act of attention, what gesture of will has been made impossible by the place where your body presently is? If you answer honestly, you may find that the list is shorter than you supposed. You may find that many of the things you thought the place had taken were things you had set down yourself and not picked back up. You may find that the place, while uncomfortable, is not the prison you described it as. You may find that the prison, if there is one, is built of materials you have been supplying. This is not a comforting thought. It is not meant to be. Seneca did not write to his mother to comfort her in the way she expected to be comforted. He wrote to clarify, for her and for himself, the actual dimensions of the loss. The actual dimensions are almost always smaller than the imagined dimensions. This is the small, hard mercy that the principle of consolation offers. Sit with the question, if you will. Not for an answer this evening, but for the long work of an answer over weeks. What has the place taken from you? And what that the place cannot reach remains. The wind off the sea, on the rocks of Corsica, did not stop blowing because a man on the island had reasoned with himself. It blew through the 8 years of his exile, and it blew after he left. But the man who walked off the island in the year 49 carried with him the same mind he had carried onto it. The place had held his body. It had not held him. This has been the lesson.